So possibly yesterday morning came and went, and you thought, well, that didn't last long. And actually what happened is I just completely forgot. Sunday night, I hit the sack, and I thought I needed a little extra sleep, so I thought I would sleep in the morning, and I slept about an hour later than I usually do, and I record these things on Monday morning, and about mid-morning on Monday, I thought, now what did I forget? Oh yeah, podcast episode. But here it is. At the end of last week in my conflict class, we were talking about communication climate. And one of the elements of communication climate we talk about is, are you fostering a climate that promotes trust or that undermines trust? And in talking about trust, we talked about someone that we talk about a lot in the conflict class, a man by the name of Morton Deutsch. Morton Deutsch is, to my mind, to the mind of a lot of folks, he's the father of modern conflict management research. Around 1948, right after the end of World War II, right after the liberation of the concentration camps, social psychology was a fairly popular field to be studying because a whole lot of social scientists wanted to know, how did Nazi Germany happen? Why didn't someone stand up and say this is unacceptable? What was going on with the group dynamics that the people you would think would serve as conscience, that they were all muted? And of course, today, you can't pay any attention to current events without there being Nazi analogies flying all over the place. What Morton Deutsch did, he was working on his doctorate in social psychology, and he got interested for his dissertation in studying conflict. And at the time, this was not its own sort of branch of any of the behavioral sciences, and his doctoral advisor said, conflict? You can't study conflict? That's crazy. Nobody studies conflict. But he did, and his big discovery was, we have this built-in default assumption that when you're in conflict with somebody else, that it's adversarial, that it's a contest, and a particular kind of contest. It is what he would come to call a competitive conflict. If you're the winner, the other party has to be a loser. But what he was able to demonstrate was that a lot of people who found themselves in conflict, especially in workplaces, their goals overlapped. You could explain to them, you could help them understand that they and the other party to conflict had a goal in common. And then, if you could get them to put the problem, the struggle, the conflict itself on the other side, and get both the parties to collaborate, to see one another as allies, then they could arrive at what we've come to call a win-win solution. If you separate your positions from your interests, if you separate your demand, where you want to wind up, what you want out of the conflict, and of course, today in 2017, a whole lot of groups in talking about various political controversies are all about these are our demands, and the statement, our demands are non-negotiable, which to a lot of these groups, it feels to them like that's the way that you exercise power. But one of the things that I talked with my class about is power pitted against an opponent. We have something in us that we think if we defeat the opponent, that's the proof that we're the most powerful we could possibly be. But really, the way that you maximize your power is to pool your power. Not power over another, but power with another. When you combine your power with someone else, that's the way that you are the most powerful. That any time you settle a conflict by breaking your opponent, by overwhelming your opponent, by vanquishing or defeating your opponent, all you've done is create the incentives for your opponent to go out and either find a way to neutralize your power or to add to her own power so that when the next round happens, and it will, that your opponent can hope for a different outcome. I didn't really intend to get into talking about power. I sort of had that in mind as a future episode. But Morton Deutsch, I found out in doing some supplementary research for this class, is also regarded as the father of the behavioral science study of trust. And so I dug through some findings over the years about trust. And trust is actually what I'm interested in at this point. And some of the findings that have come out of a few decades of research into trust, the drive to trust, the emphasis on trust, it tends to happen at the point in a relationship when people don't yet know one another very well, when our knowledge of other people is shallow, when the relationships are still fairly new, fairly thin, fairly underdeveloped, and therefore there's a lot that's mysterious about the other person. We talk about this a number of different ways in my academic field. We talk about how what motivates people to communicate is their uncertainty. And when uncertainty is high, you're motivated to do a lot of communicating to try to reduce it. We talk about how in the early stages of relationships, we do a lot of self-disclosure, but it tends to be pretty shallow self-disclosure that's near the surface. And what we're doing is we are offering up information about ourselves to make ourselves less mysterious, to reduce uncertainty. But then, as the relationship gets closer, that's when you can start disclosing things that are deeper and deeper. Well, as far as trust is concerned, when there's still very high uncertainty, when there still has been very limited self-disclosure, that's where we tend to put a lot of emphasis on the importance of trust, when there are a lot of gaps to fill. And so we decide whether a person can be trusted based on what we observe when we look at what are called trust diagnostic situations. Trust diagnostic situations. And here I can say maybe a working definition of trust. I don't think this is anyone's formal published academic definition, but if I were to pull a working definition just out of my memory of gearing up to give this lecture, it would be, do you feel that it is appropriate? Do you feel motivated or safe making yourself vulnerable to another person, knowing that even if it is to that person's advantage to act in a way that disadvantages you, they would still choose not to? Now, that was kind of long-winded and had a lot of words in it, but to try to simplify it down a little bit, if you know, let's say you're deciding whether to trust Bob. If you know that Bob is going to be in a situation where Bob might benefit by throwing you under the bus, Bob might benefit by doing something that sets you back, if you're confident Bob wouldn't do it, then that is the definition of what we mean by trust. One of the findings that comes out of research into trust that I lingered on a little bit was that there are certain traits that we have that they predict how we will interpret a trust diagnostic situation. And these three, I think all three of them, in some way, they feed into what I have been seeing, or quite possibly, more appropriately, what I've not been seeing, what I've been overlooking about civic engagement over the past couple of years. And those three are, first of all, self-esteem. If our self-esteem is not at a healthy level, then we are likely to observe how other people behave in a trust diagnostic situation. And a trust diagnostic situation, just in case that wasn't clear before, is a situation where we can tell they have something to gain by acting in a way that disadvantages us. Well, if your self-esteem is not at a healthy level, we already know that people who have unhealthy self-esteem, the way they interpret what other people do, if their self-esteem is low, they will interpret it in a way that confirms their opinion of themselves, and they'll also do it if it's unnaturally high. So if you see someone behave in a way that's loyal to you, then you might, if your self-esteem is low, you might conclude that, well, they just didn't see enough benefit for themselves, or they had a hidden motive that I haven't really noticed. But as far as them really being loyal to me, nobody else is. Everybody hates me. Everybody treats me like garbage. That might be the inner monologue, the negative self-talk of someone with low self-esteem, and it impacts how they interpret what they observe in a trust diagnostic situation. And so I would say generally people in that situation find it a lot harder to trust. A second characteristic that predicts how people interpret trust diagnostic situations is something from the field of psychology referred to as an attachment style. And I have here a very, very vague and undetailed summary of this I'm going to offer up. It's not my field. We borrow from it a lot for reasons that'll be obvious in the study of communication and relational development. But put crudely, it's the idea that your experience with the very first relationships you have in your life, your relationship with your very first caregiver, whether that was your parents, your grandparents, whether it was a nanny, your first memory of how other people interact with you, that sets a pattern that goes for the rest of your life. And there are labels for it. There's a secure attachment style. There's the anxious avoidant, anxious preoccupied, dismissive. But basically, a real simple device for understanding these comes from an old 1970s self-help book, and it was called I'm Okay, You're Okay. Because the building blocks of attachment style are how do you feel about yourself, how do you feel about other people. And if you think I'm okay, you're okay, basically I am a likable person that other people are drawn to, and other people are also likable, and I have good reason to attach with them. That's a secure attachment style. And people who have that attachment style tend not to worry that much that they're going to be abandoned, that others are not going to commit to relationships with them. Then there's I'm okay, you're not okay, which is that I am basically a good person, but you are very likely to betray me, manipulate me, hurt me, so I will keep to myself, and other people I have no interest in. Then there's I'm not okay, you are okay, and that is the anxious preoccupied style, and the notion there is that it's similar to what I was describing before about a person who has low self-esteem, but nevertheless finds other people very, very attractive and desirable to connect with, and therefore tends to try too hard, tends to be needy, tends to be desperate, and tends to believe that even people who show kindness, warmth, and friendship are really just scheming up for when they're going to abandon you. And then there's I'm not okay, you're not okay, which is the avoidant conflict style. And it's actually, I think that's the anxious dismissive conflict style, that other people, it's not good to get close to other people because you're just asking for it, and besides which, they aren't going to like me anyway because I'm fundamentally not a good person. So we do know, and it should be fairly obvious after you hear this, that people's attachment styles, those are also lenses through which they will interpret what it is they see in a trust diagnostic situation. And I think, even though my understanding of attachment styles is that people's attachment style tends to be set when they're still fairly young, I also know that there are some signs that relationships that we have later on in life can make at least some change to the attachment style. And I think some of what I'm going to talk about where I think trust is going, part of the mechanism here, part of the vector for these changes might be that people's attachment styles are changing, not necessarily in intimate relationships, not even necessarily in workplace relationships, but quite possibly in what in a previous generation would have been the sense of neighborhood. What would have been the sense of you have friends, and they are friends simply because they live the same place you do. And probably I could get off into another discussion of social capital and Robert Putnam's book Bowling Alone, and how there are so many fewer people who feel they have very many close friends. I'm not that interested in close friends or loneliness in this vein so much as I am the sense that it's important to know the people who live around you. That just by virtue of the fact that your home is on the same sort of geographic footprint as other people, there are concerns you have in common, that talking to them about those concerns is healthy, and that pooling your voices to come to the attention of the decision makers, that's also healthy. Okay, self-esteem in some ways predicts how we interpret trust diagnostic situation, and so does attachment style. The third is self-differentiation. Self-differentiation. And I will confess, this was a brand new concept to me. Never in my life really, well, not never in my life, not since high school have I had a class in psychology, so I've just sort of picked up the bits and pieces of psychology that we use in the communication field. Self-differentiation, as I understand it, is can you separate your thoughts from your emotions? When you're caught in the grip of a powerful emotion, can you see that that's independent of your thinking? Can you feel angry, but at the same time tell yourself you don't have a good reason to be angry? Can you be afraid, but at the same time tell yourself, I have no good reason to be afraid? I do have the physical sensation, and I've put the label on it that says this sensation is because of fear, but that doesn't mean that there's anything particularly true about reality. And that's something that I talk a lot with my public speaking students about. When you're up in front of the room, you feel intense fear, which is your body's way of telling you that you feel endangered and you should remove yourself from the situation in order to be safe. But in that case, that emotion is not reliable, because in a whole lot of circumstances, you can be in front of the room ready to talk to an audience, and you're not in any danger at all. As a matter of fact, it's a great opportunity. And so people who can feel that sensation, experience that fear, but then tell themselves, do the thinking work to say, I'm not in any danger, they are self-differentiated. People, on the other hand, who say, well, something must be wrong or I wouldn't feel so afraid. Someone must have done something wrong to me or I wouldn't feel so angry. Those are people who have low self-differentiation and poor self-differentiation. And so that's another one of the factors that is a lens through which we interpret trust diagnostic situations. And I will say that I have read over and over again, I read it, I don't know that I've really encountered it face-to-face, because in my daily life I move through a bubble where I'm surrounded by academics and students. But it really seems as though more and more people pay less and less attention to things that are measurable and put less and less trust into reports of facts and figures, and they'll dismiss all that and say, so the numbers tell me that crime is falling, but I don't feel safe. The numbers tell me that the economy is improving, but I'm not feeling it where I am. Okay, all of this sort of build-up, which took longer than I really wanted it to take, gets me to the phenomenon, and the phenomenon's been around for a couple of decades now. I think it's just hitting a boil right about now. The phenomenon of demagoguery. Demagoguery. And what a demagogue does is a demagogue speaks to an audience and tells the audience, only trust me, don't trust others. Only listen to me, but whenever you come upon anybody who disagrees with me, who takes a position separate from me, not only are they wrong, not only will I give you my reasons that you should disagree with them, but you should shun them. You should break off contact with them. And I think that is a lot of what's happening, I think, within our social fabric. I think that the particular kind of political polarization that we're experiencing right now is very much, it's a manifestation of demagoguery. And there are political voices who are very explicit about demagoguing, and there always have been. I try not to fall into the kind of naive mistake of being nostalgic about the past. Political disagreements have always been nasty. There's always been plenty of hostility. It's always tipped over into hatred. Around the time I came of age and became an adult, it was Rush Limbaugh, and Rush Limbaugh would say explicitly on his radio show, you are superior to these liberals are your enemies, they do not want what's best for you, they want to destroy you, you've got to destroy them first. And that's textbook demagoguery, and something that I talked about a couple of episodes ago. He did that, honestly, because it's good business. He did that because there was a listenership that would receive it. So even though he's not my favorite person, and I don't really enjoy listening to that program, I have to say if nobody had listened to him, he would not have continued to say it, which means it's not a matter of he's just guilty of committing some offense. It's that there was a center out there, there was a current in opinion that was ready to hear it, and that is what concerns me, and that is what I think that we could become more healthy, and I think that our civic engagement could get back on track if we could pin down where did that current come from and what can we do to make neighbors feel more like neighbors. What could we do to restore trust? And I feel like I'm being a little bit of a broken record, and some weeks I feel like I really state the obvious, but economic dislocation and very, very rapid social change that's very jarring and dislocating to people who woke up in a different world, it can feel downright terrifying to have something wrong and not have a name for it. It can feel downright terrifying to feel that you lose all your power, you lose everything familiar, you see what you were brought up to believe is right and normal and worth keeping, and it's all eroding and sliding away, and you can't put a name on it. And it can feel very much like a release, very, very comforting when a name is put on it, when it's identified with a group, and all of a sudden you have a common enemy, And it's a common enemy because you have allies. And so you and your allies make up an in-group, and the people to whom you've attributed all these changes, they're the out-group. These people that are your enemy, they're the people who are violating what you think are the basic pillars of civilization. They are people who, even if they think those changes are for the best, they move very, very fast. And I will also add, those people who are pushing for change to happen this quickly, they're applying totalizing labels that dismiss you, and they're not trying to bring you along, they're writing you off. They've already identified you as the enemy. And what is hard for me is that they that I just described, I'm part of it. I'm guilty of all those things. Now, the first one, that I violate what other people think are the basic pillars of civilization, I mean, when I was a child, it was still a widely held belief among perfectly reasonable adults that interracial dating was a very bad idea, that it was hard on children, that it invited all kinds of social friction that was unnecessary. Today, I think that idea is pretty quaint, but there are people who grew up in a world where that was out of line. And I definitely grew up in a world where people who were homosexual weren't public about it, and I not only came of age, but I moved into middle age, still having only a vague understanding of transgender. And I still only have a vague understanding of it. I may be one of the people who've moved too fast, and I definitely have been one of the people to dismiss those who struggle by applying labels, by calling them some really, really pejorative names and assuming that they have bad motives, assuming that they are deliberately hostile, that they're the ones who created enemies first, when really my own behaviors, my own language choices are creating enemies, and I'm not reaching out and bringing other people along. And I was listening earlier this week, it was an episode of Code Switch, I think, on NPR, and they interviewed a documentary filmmaker, one of the documentary filmmakers, African-American documentary filmmakers, who's nominated for an Academy Award, and she quoted Toni Morrison and said, "It is a waste of time for me to argue to racists that my life has value." But that, once again, you know, it's like saying, it is not my problem that my house is burning down. Well, if you don't want to bring others along, then what is happening right now is perfectly predictable. And I have to say that people on my end of the political spectrum also are very, very fond, I think people on all points of the political spectrum are fond of this, of narratives of heroic breakthrough. So one of our favorite parts of the career of Abraham Lincoln and one of our favorite parts of the Civil War is the Emancipation Proclamation, then followed by the 13th Amendment, but we forget that what came afterward was Reconstruction. And there are a lot of people who treat Brown versus Board of Education and Roe versus Wade as great heroic moments. And I have to say, I like what they said. I like the position they took. But I wonder if we're going to look back with the distance of history, and if we're going to say that Roe versus Wade especially, and the argument could be made, believe it or not, for Brown versus Board of Education, that they did more harm than good. That what they did is they slammed the door on what should have been generational change. There's a professor I had years ago. The professor and I are not on particularly amiable terms today, but years ago, he put it like this. He said that change was evolutionary, not revolutionary, and that revolutions invite counter-revolutions. And I think that that is what we're right in the middle of. I think that's what we're seeing playing out right now. And I think it is that all of these, I think that the pressure on a fault line built up to where it came to a rupture. And the problem is, when the rupture goes your way, you forget that it can go the other way as well. And Roe versus Wade was cataclysmic for a whole lot of people in the United States. Brown versus Board of Education was cataclysmic. The election of Donald Trump was cataclysmic. What's happening here is, when dialogue breaks off, when there are decisive moves, disruptive moves, upsetting moves, those are the moments where I think trust has broken down. I think that when people feel like they can't get ahead economically, and they feel Like when they describe the world in the way they understand best, they are dismissed with labels, insulting labels that make them unemployable and unfit to appear and speak their minds in public. Well, what do you expect that to do to their self-esteem? When that's the kind of behavior, that's the kind of treatment that they encounter in public, well, what do you expect that to do as far as moderating their attachment style? And when you put those two together to where people's frustration builds and there doesn't seem to be any remedy for it, what do you expect to happen as people's emotions, as they stifle their emotions, try to manage their emotions, but their emotions grow and grow and grow and they ruminate over them? It doesn't really surprise me either that they get to a point where self-differentiation becomes almost impossible. Because all of us, I think the evidence is quite clear, we overestimate quite how rational we are, and we way underestimate how much motivated reasoning we do to line up our thinking in service of the emotions that we have not been able to resolve. What I think anybody who's ever been a parent, and I've never been a parent, but I think most parents would agree that I had this one right. You don't teach a lesson, not an important lesson, to your child one time. You teach it over and over and over again. And you remind, and you explain, and you model, and you have to be consistent, and you have to reinforce. Well, it's the same thing. You don't teach a humane world to your neighbors in one moment. You don't teach empathy and progress and inclusion and the breaking up of ignorance to your neighbors with a big heroic breakthrough any more than they teach you about how the struggles that they have are not malicious and they're not violent and they're not homicidal and they are doing the best they can to make progress, and they're doing the best they can to be your neighbor, but sometimes they feel pushed into a corner by you. And when you corner people, this is another thing that we talk about in the conflict class, a lot of times when people seem so hostile and so ready to reject you, it's because they feel as though you have so much power that the only thing that's left to them is to put on a threat display. So I'm down into the last couple of minutes of this, and I think, there are models of how relationships develop that in the entry stage of a relationship, it's still pretty thin and pretty shallow, and that's why we lean on trust a whole lot, because there are gaps in what we know. But then there are also the movement out of relationship and the moves of relational distancing, and the social penetration model, which is about self-disclosure, also accounts for the phenomenon of depenetration. And quite possibly what we're seeing, you would think with gaps, we would want to find some basis to trust, because these are still people who live right down the block from us. These are still the people who work alongside us in our workplaces and the people whose votes count just as much as ours. And if we really could act in our own self-interest, we would try to find a basis for trust, because then those gaps in what we know and what we understand, we could live with those gaps. Because it's when the relationships get more developed and more familiar, then really what we want to do is we want accuracy in our assessments of other people. And, maybe that's it. Here with about a minute left in this particular wrap, maybe that's what we've done, is we have come up with distorted, false attributions, dismissive attributions, and we've stopped trusting because we think we know everything there is to know about these people that we've turned into the out-group. And now that we've taken the comforting move of identifying our allies and turning them into the enemy, so that we can take all of this anxiety over a changed world and we can vent it by becoming hostile, adversarial, and going out to try to win a contest. Maybe that's why we don't trust anymore, because we feel like we've moved far enough into the relationship that the relationship is one of enmity, and there are no longer gaps that need to be filled by trust. And what I would aim myself at, and what I would hope we all would aim at, would be to get back to a point where we could put the problem on the other side, and we could all pool our power. I mean, Hillary Clinton's campaign wasn't successful, but her slogan was right: we are stronger together.